in the heart of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a name once spoken with reverence would soon echo through courtrooms and tabloids alike. Pastor Carlton Dotson. Known for his fiery sermons and his unwavering declarations of faith, Dotson was the kind of man who could command a room with his voice. To his congregation, he was a man of God. To the people closest to him, there were cracks, small fractures in a man burdened with quiet paranoia, a past riddled with insecurity, and an unsettling change that no one could quite explain. Dotson's story begins in the early 2000s, in a small Baptist congregation where he met his cousin by marriage, a young woman named LaToya Watts, and her husband, Patrick Dennehy, a promising basketball player at Baylor University. Dennehy was tall, charismatic, and ambitious. He had transferred schools to chase a dream of playing in the NBA. Dotson, despite his reputation as a preacher, often drifted between churches, trying to find his place both spiritually and financially. When he befriended Patrick, the two quickly became inseparable, two men of different paths, bound by faith and shared struggles. But underneath that friendship was tension. Dotson had always felt overshadowed by others. Patrick had the looks, the success, and the respect that Dotson craved but could never sustain. And in the summer of 2003, that resentment would find its way into a violent act that shocked the nation and forever linked a pastor's name with murder. It began with whispers. Patrick had gone missing. His girlfriend reported that she hadn't seen him for days. Baylor University officials were concerned as he'd missed practices and calls. The police launched an investigation, but leads were scarce. Then, a chilling discovery. Dotson, the last person seen with Patrick, had abruptly left town, telling people strange stories about threats and paranoia. Within weeks, his behavior became erratic. Family members noticed his speech made little sense, filled with references to evil spirits and people trying to kill him. When investigators finally located Dotson in Maryland, he was no longer the confident preacher who once delivered fiery sermons. Instead, he appeared hollowed out, gaunt and trembling. During questioning, Dotson confessed in a dazed monotone that he had shot Patrick Dennehy in self-defense. He claimed Patrick was plotting to kill him, that something dark had taken hold. But the details didn't match. Dennehy's body, later found in a field outside Waco, told a different story. A single gunshot wound to the head, fired execution style. The news sent shockwaves through the Baylor community. A preacher accused of killing a young athlete. It was unthinkable. The story consumed the media, and as the investigation deepened, it exposed a darker underside of both men's lives. Baylor's athletic program was suddenly under scrutiny for improper benefits and corruption. But Dotson's case stood apart. His descent into delusion, his conflicting statements, and his erratic faith became a study in how a man's mind could unravel beneath the weight of guilt and belief. Psychiatric evaluations painted a tragic picture. Dotson believed he was being haunted, that demons were chasing him through his dreams, whispering in his sermons. He was found incompetent to stand trial multiple times, spending months in psychiatric care before eventually being deemed fit. When his case reached court, he pleaded guilty to murder. There was no elaborate defense, no grand declaration of innocence, only a quiet admission of guilt. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. For the congregation who once called him Brother Carlton, it was impossible to reconcile. Some said he had fallen victim to the devil he preached against. Others believed he had always carried darkness within him, masked by the cloth of faith. When he was transferred to a Texas state prison, he reportedly continued to preach to inmates, holding small Bible studies in the yard. Even behind bars, he spoke of redemption, of forgiveness, of the war between good and evil raging inside every man. But his sermons carried a different tone now. They weren't the booming, confident speeches of a church leader. They were quiet, confessional, like a man trying to convince himself that salvation was still possible. In a 2005 interview, he said softly, "Sometimes the hardest place to find God is in your own heart." It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said. Patrick Dennehy's family, however, could find no solace in his words. They remembered a bright young man whose life had been cut short, whose dream of playing professional basketball ended in a dusty field. His mother said, "He trusted him because he was a man of God, and that's what hurts most." It was a sentiment shared by many who followed the case. The pain of betrayal not just by a person, but by an institution meant to represent goodness. As the years passed, the story faded from headlines, but remained in documentaries and discussions about mental health, faith, and accountability. Carlton Dotson's name became a haunting reminder of how religion, when tangled with instability and ego, can turn into something unrecognizable. His former church removed all mentions of him from their records, and many who had once stood beside him refused to speak his name again. Yet in prison he reportedly still prays before every meal. Some inmates say he keeps a worn Bible by his bed, its pages marked with handwritten notes and underlines. To some he is still Pastor Dotson. To others he's just another murderer serving his time. And somewhere between those two identities, preacher and killer, lies the truth of a man who believed he was chosen by God, only to end up condemned by his own sins. When asked if he believed God had forgiven him, he looked at the reporter and said, "I hope so. But I don't know if I can forgive myself." That line lingered, a tragic echo from a man once trusted to lead others to grace, who instead became a cautionary tale whispered in the corners of faith communities across America. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, a once celebrated figure of faith stood before a courtroom that had run out of sympathy. His name was Jerry Payne, a pastor who, for more than 20 years, led a thriving congregation known as New Life Fellowship. To his followers, Pastor Payne was an example of humility, a man who had risen from poverty through perseverance and divine favor. But as the court clerk read the charges, wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement, the illusion shattered. Behind the pulpit's glow of holiness had lived a man whose hunger for control and wealth would drive him into moral ruin. Jerry Payne's sermons were legendary in his community. He spoke of sacrifice, service, and generosity. People said that when he preached, he made you feel like God was in the room. By the early 2000s, his church had grown from a few dozen attendees in a rented school gym to a full campus with a broadcast studio, daycare, and even a private Christian academy. Donations poured in from across Illinois. But beneath the growing empire, Payne's financial dealings were far from divine. It began subtly, a missing receipt here, an unexplained expense there. Church board members occasionally questioned the spending, but Payne always had an answer. "It's all for the ministry," he'd say. "God's work requires faith." And because he spoke with conviction, no one pressed further. The congregation adored him. They believed every word. But the first red flag appeared when a longtime treasurer resigned unexpectedly, citing ethical disagreements. Rumors began to circulate. Payne dismissed them during Sunday service, calling them the devil's distraction. The audience applauded. They didn't know that behind the scenes, federal investigators were already gathering evidence. Over the next 2 years, the truth came to light. Pastor Payne had secretly diverted more than $2 million in donations to personal accounts. The money, originally given to fund missionary work and community outreach, was instead used to buy luxury vehicles, a lake house, and extravagant vacations. He even used church funds to finance a series of business ventures, including a Christian-themed clothing line that never existed beyond a website mock-up. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was how he manipulated faith itself to maintain control. Members later testified that Payne often preached about seeding blessings, insisting that large financial gifts would open heavenly doors. Some elderly congregants emptied savings accounts at his urging. Others mortgaged their homes to support what they believed was a divine mission. When anyone questioned where the money went, Payne would remind them of biblical obedience. You don't question the shepherd. You trust the call of God. By 2015, the IRS and FBI had built a solid case. Agents executed a search warrant on church offices, seizing boxes of financial documents. The scandal broke within days, splashed across local and national headlines. Cameras camped outside the church gates as shocked members wept in disbelief. Payne initially denied all wrongdoing, claiming it was a spiritual attack. But as evidence piled up, his defiance crumbled. In court, the prosecutors painted him as a man consumed by greed. They showed pictures of his lavish home filled with marble floors and imported wine racks, paid for by the same people who once prayed for him. They revealed emails where Payne instructed staff to falsify donation records. Even his private assistant, a woman who had served him faithfully for 10 years, broke down on the witness stand. He said God wanted him to have nice things, she whispered through tears. When it was his turn to speak, Payne stood silent for a long time before finally addressing the judge. "I lost sight," he said quietly. "I thought I was building God's kingdom, but I was only building mine." It was a rare moment of honesty, but it came too late. The court sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison and ordered restitution exceeding $5 million. His church dissolved soon after. The once bustling parking lot became overgrown. The building sold to another congregation. Former members struggled to reconcile their faith with their betrayal. One woman told a reporter, "He baptized my children. He prayed at my husband's funeral. I believed in him more than anyone else. And he used that trust to take everything." In prison, Payne's persona changed. Gone were the tailored suits and polished shoes. He worked in the laundry unit and kept mostly to himself. Yet fellow inmates said he occasionally gathered a few men on Sundays for prayer, still trying to lead in his own quiet way. When asked by a journalist years later whether he still saw himself as a pastor, he replied, "I'm a broken one. But maybe broken pastors can still talk to broken men." That interview circulated online, sparking debate. Some saw it as an attempt at redemption. Others saw manipulation continuing behind bars. But the scars he left behind were deep. For his victims, people who trusted their spiritual leader with their livelihoods, justice felt hollow. The money was gone, but so was something far greater, faith in goodness itself. When he became eligible for parole, a few members of his old congregation wrote letters supporting his release. They said forgiveness was part of the gospel. Others opposed it fiercely, writing that he had stolen God's name for profit. The divide mirrored something larger in the community, the uneasy intersection of faith and power, belief and exploitation. Years later, one of the church's youth ministers summarized it best. "He taught us about heaven, but he built his own version of it on earth. And when it collapsed, so did everything we believed about him." Even after his release, Payne reportedly lives quietly, away from cameras, away from churches. But every now and then, his name resurfaces in sermons about integrity, in lectures about spiritual abuse, in documentaries that revisit the case as a warning of what happens when trust turns into control. His story isn't about a man who lost faith. It's about one who used it until it consumed him. And for those who once looked up at the pulpit, eyes closed in prayer, it remains a painful memory that sometimes the voice that preaches the loudest about God can be the one hiding the darkest sin. In the small, tightly knit town of Hammond, Indiana, Pastor Jack Schaap was more than just a religious leader. He was a celebrity. His congregation numbered in the thousands, his sermons broadcast across the country, and his influence stretched deep into Christian education and youth ministries. He was seen as a pillar of purity and family values, the kind of man parents trusted without question. But what they didn't know was that behind the fiery sermons and polished image was a secret that would destroy everything he'd built, a forbidden relationship with a teenage girl that would send him to federal prison and shatter a church community that once worshipped his every word. Jack Schaap's rise began at the First Baptist Church of Hammond, one of the largest independent Baptist churches in America. He was the hand-picked successor of the legendary pastor Jack Hyles, a man who had built the church into a religious empire. Schaap inherited not just the pulpit but a movement, a vast network of followers, schools, and Bible colleges that hung on his every teaching. To many, Schaap was untouchable, a man chosen by God to lead. His voice carried authority, his charisma filled the sanctuary, and his words had the power to move people to tears. But absolute power has a way of breeding blindness, both in the one who holds it and those who follow. It began quietly with a girl who had grown up in the congregation. She was 16 when Pastor Schaap first took an interest in her. At first it seemed innocent. He was her counselor, helping her through personal struggles, encouraging her to stay faithful. But the line between spiritual guidance and personal intimacy began to blur. What started as counseling sessions turned into long car rides, private messages, and secret meetings that crossed every boundary of decency and law. The girl, like many in the church, revered him. She saw him as a father figure, a man of God who could do no wrong. When he told her that what they shared was special, she believed him. When he said that their connection was sanctified, she trusted him. It was manipulation disguised as mentorship, and it worked for a while. The first sign of something wrong came from a photo, an image that would unravel everything. It was found accidentally on a church computer. Schaap and the teenage girl sitting close together, sharing an intimate moment. The image spread among staff quietly until one brave employee decided to alert church leadership. The revelation hit the congregation like a bomb. People who had known Schaap for decades refused to believe it. He wouldn't do that, they said. Not Pastor Jack. But as the investigation deepened, the truth became undeniable. Schaap had used his position to groom and exploit the teenager. The church, faced with evidence and mounting pressure, finally reported the crime to authorities. Schaap was removed from his position, and the FBI stepped in. What they uncovered was even worse than anyone imagined. A pattern of communication that revealed his manipulation in full. He had sent explicit messages, written letters romanticizing their encounters, and even claimed their relationship was ordained by God. The betrayal cut deep because Schaap's sermons had always railed against immorality. He preached against lust, against the sins of the flesh. To many, he was the moral compass of conservative Christianity. And now that compass was shattered. In court, the prosecution laid out a detailed timeline. The grooming, the manipulation, the transport of the minor across state lines for sexual encounters, a federal offense under the Mann Act. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, pointing to Schaap's exhaustion and mental strain from years of ministry. But the jury saw what it truly was, abuse of power, cloaked in Scripture. During sentencing, Schaap stood before the judge, once again addressing an audience. But this time no one applauded. His voice trembled as he said, "I betrayed my church, my wife, my God, and this young woman. I don't ask for forgiveness. I know I must earn it." The judge, unmoved, sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. The fallout was devastating. First Baptist Church of Hammond, once a beacon of faith, became a symbol of scandal. Families who had worshipped there for generations left in disillusionment. Some refused to believe the verdict, clinging to denial. Others felt their faith itself had been violated. One church member said in tears, "We trusted him with our children. We trusted him with our souls." Inside prison, Schaap's life changed completely. Gone was the commanding preacher who stood before thousands. He spent his days doing menial work, often in silence. Some inmates recognized him, either from TV or from the news, and mocked him for his hypocrisy. Others sought him out for prayer, drawn to the broken figure of a man who had once preached holiness and now wore an inmate's uniform. In rare interviews, Schaap spoke about guilt. He said that his downfall came not from lust, but from pride, the belief that he was above temptation. "I thought because I was God's man I couldn't fall," he said. "But that's when I fell the hardest." The girl he abused has chosen to live privately, far from the spotlight. Her family, after years of silence, once said through an attorney that they hoped people would remember the cost of blind trust. How easily faith can be weaponized by those in power. The church has since restructured under new leadership, but it still bears the scars. Some members never returned. Others continue to attend, determined to reclaim what was lost. And as for Schaap, his name has become a warning. Among pastors it's spoken with shame, among victims with anger, among those who once idolized him with disbelief. He was released in 2023 after serving 10 years. He now lives quietly, far from the pulpit that once made him famous. But the echoes of his sermons remain online, his words about purity and righteousness forever stained by the hypocrisy behind them. When people ask what happened to Pastor Jack Schaap, those who remember don't talk about the court case first. They talk about the feeling, the collective heartbreak of watching a man they trusted turn into something they never imagined. Because that's what betrayal by faith does. It doesn't just destroy trust in a man, it shakes your trust in goodness itself. In the end, Schaap's story isn't just about crime or punishment. It's about the dangerous power of reverence, how the higher we lift someone up, the further they have to fall. And when they do, they don't just break themselves. They break everyone who believed in them. In Detroit, Michigan, Pastor Lonnie Johnson was a man whose words carried weight beyond the pulpit. He had the kind of charisma that made strangers believe, the kind of voice that turned Sunday sermons into emotional experiences. For 2 decades, his church, Mount Hope Ministries, grew from a small gathering in a rented storefront to a sprawling complex that fed the poor, clothed the homeless, and baptized hundreds. He preached about salvation, discipline, and integrity, about how the devil takes many forms, especially temptation. But the temptation that would ruin him wasn't alcohol or lust or fame. It was greed. Pastor Johnson had built his reputation on financial prudence. He often told his congregation, "We don't worship money. We use it to serve God." The church books seemed spotless, the donations steady, the programs thriving. Yet behind closed doors, Johnson was running a secret operation that turned his sanctuary into the center of a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, one that would leave his followers broke and his legacy in ashes. It started with a pitch that sounded harmless. Johnson began telling members about a special investment program, a way for faithful donors to sow their resources and watch God multiply them. He claimed that a Christian-owned financial group was partnering with churches to generate profits for missions and community work. All it required was faith, and of course money. The pitch was convincing. He backed it with biblical parables about seeds and harvests, and his smooth tone made it sound almost divine. Churchgoers trusted him completely. They invested their life savings, retirement funds, and inheritances. Many even borrowed money to plant a bigger seed. Johnson promised them returns of 15 to 20%, saying it was God's blessing on believers. But there was no investment fund. There was no Christian finance partner. The entire operation was a Ponzi scheme, built on lies and faith. For almost 4 years, Johnson used the money from new investors to pay off earlier ones, creating the illusion of success. As the church's reputation grew, so did the deception. Johnson began driving luxury cars, wearing designer suits, and hosting lavish events. When asked about his newfound wealth, he'd smile and say, "God rewards those who serve him." It all began to unravel when a member named Carolyn Pierce noticed something odd. Her statements never came on time, and when she asked to withdraw a part of her investment to help her daughter with college tuition, Johnson delayed again and again. "The funds are tied up," he said. "We just have to wait for the harvest." Carolyn didn't buy it. She went to the police, who quietly launched an investigation. Over the next few months, federal agents uncovered the staggering truth. More than $7 million had been funneled through fake accounts and shell companies, all controlled by Pastor Johnson and a small circle of associates. The money that was meant for missions had been spent on homes, jewelry, and trips to the Bahamas. The day the FBI raided the church offices, many parishioners thought it was a mistake. They watched in disbelief as agents carried out boxes of records, computers, and files. When Johnson was led out in handcuffs, the crowd outside wept. Some shouted his name, pleading for an explanation. Others stood in silence, staring as the man they once called Shepherd was loaded into a federal vehicle. The trial was merciless. The prosecutors described how Johnson had targeted his own congregation, exploiting their faith and vulnerability. They called it one of the most emotionally manipulative frauds in the state's history. In their opening statement, they said, "He didn't just steal their money, he stole their trust in God's house." Witness after witness testified about lost savings, foreclosed homes, and marriages that fell apart under financial strain. Johnson's defense argued that he never intended to deceive anyone, that he believed the investments were legitimate but had been duped by partners. But the evidence was overwhelming. His signature was on every fake document, his voice on recorded phone calls promising guaranteed returns. He had even used church funds to pay off personal credit card debt and to install a $40,000 home theater system in his mansion. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Former church members filled every bench, some still clutching worn Bibles. Johnson walked in wearing a plain suit, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he paused for a long time before speaking. "I was a man who preached about stewardship," he said quietly. "But I became a man who stole from those who trusted me the most. I don't ask this court for mercy. I ask my people, my flock, for forgiveness." The judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison, calling his actions a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial crime. There were no cheers, no sighs of relief. Just a hollow silence that filled the room as guards escorted him away. After his conviction, the church dissolved within months. The building was sold, its cross removed, its sign repainted for a new congregation that moved in later. The scars, however, remained. Many of his former members never returned to organized religion. Others struggled with bitterness, unsure how to separate God from the man who claimed to speak for him. From prison, Johnson occasionally wrote letters to his old congregation. Some were apologetic, others reflective. In one letter he wrote, "The devil didn't tempt me with sin. He tempted me with success." Those words appeared in a newspaper years later, quoted by one of his victims who said, "He was right." He worshipped success more than God. Behind bars, Johnson tried to start a Bible study group, but few inmates joined. Word spread fast. Nobody trusted a preacher with a record like his. Over time, he withdrew, keeping mostly to himself, reportedly spending hours reading the same scriptures he once used to convince others to part with their money. He was released after serving 17 years. No church welcomed him back. No ministry offered him redemption. In his old neighborhood, the mention of his name still stirs resentment. Some say they've seen him at small-town diners, eating alone, a man who once commanded crowds now sitting in silence. His story remains a painful reminder of how easily good intentions can become corruption when wrapped in spiritual authority. For those who gave everything to him, the damage was more than financial. It was spiritual, emotional. The kind of wound that makes you question every sermon, every promise, every prayer you ever believed in. And perhaps the cruelest irony is this. Pastor Johnson spent his life warning others about the love of money, yet it was that very love that became his undoing. In the end, it wasn't the devil who destroyed him. It was himself. In Atlanta, Georgia, the name Eddie Long once carried the weight of a promise. He was the face of prosperity preaching in the South, a charismatic orator who filled stadiums with messages about power, success, and divine destiny. His megachurch, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, was more than a house of worship. It was a movement, a brand, a phenomenon. He shook hands with presidents, appeared on television, and lived in a mansion with a fleet of luxury cars parked behind guarded gates. To his followers, Bishop Eddie Long was proof that faith could lead to abundance. But behind that polished image, the gospel he preached would collapse under the weight of secrets he spent years trying to hide. For more than 2 decades, Long presented himself as a spiritual father to young men in his congregation, mentoring, guiding and supporting them financially through scholarships and travel programs. The church even had a program called the Longfellows Youth Academy, designed to teach discipline, leadership, and purity. But for 4 of those young men, that mentorship would turn into something far more sinister. In 2010, 4 former church members came forward with allegations that Long had coerced them into sexual relationships while they were still teenagers. Their claims shook the foundation of the church and sent shockwaves through the Christian community. Each of the men described a disturbingly similar pattern: gifts, private trips, hotel stays, and late-night spiritual counseling sessions that blurred the lines between mentorship and manipulation. They described being invited into his inner circle, a group of boys who were treated like royalty. They wore expensive suits bought by Long, traveled on his private jet, and received lavish gifts, from jewelry to cars. But those privileges came at a cost. According to their accounts, Long used scripture to justify intimacy, telling them that what they shared was a covenant between spiritual fathers and sons. The accusations ignited national outrage. For years, Long had preached against homosexuality, condemning it as sin. Now he was accused of exploiting young men under the guise of spiritual mentorship. Cameras flooded the church grounds as reporters demanded answers. On the following Sunday, the sanctuary filled to capacity. Thousands watched as Bishop Long took the stage, wearing a black suit and carrying a Bible. His voice trembled slightly as he declared, "I am not a perfect man, but I am not the man portrayed in these allegations. I will fight." His words drew applause, but behind the cheers was unease. Many didn't know what to believe. The civil suits detailed years of grooming. One young man said Long began touching him inappropriately during prayer. Another said Long told him, "This is how David loved Jonathan." There were photographs of the bishop embracing the teens, text messages referring to them as "my spiritual sons," and receipts for expensive hotels. The pattern was impossible to ignore. When the case reached the courts, Long's defense team moved swiftly to settle. In 2011, just before the case could go to trial, he reached confidential settlements with all 4 accusers. The exact amount was never disclosed, but reports suggested millions. Though he never admitted guilt, the damage was irreversible. Long stepped away from the pulpit for a short period, citing personal reflection. But when he returned, his sermons had changed. Gone were the fiery prosperity messages. In their place were softer words about endurance and pain. He spoke of betrayal, forgiveness, and the weight of judgment. To some it sounded like repentance. To others it sounded like manipulation. The church began to fracture. Attendance plummeted. Long's empire, once built on gleaming marble floors and television deals, started to crumble. Financial investigations followed, uncovering mismanagement of funds and unpaid taxes. By the mid-2010s, Long faced scrutiny not only for the sexual abuse allegations, but also for allegations of financial misconduct involving his nonprofit organizations. Federal investigators found that millions in church funds had been redirected to support Long's lavish lifestyle, luxury cars, real estate ventures, and extravagant gifts. He claimed these were love offerings, voluntary donations given out of gratitude. But the IRS saw them differently. In 2014, the church quietly reached a settlement with the IRS to resolve tax discrepancies totaling more than $7 million. Behind the scenes, Long's health began to decline. He grew thinner, weaker. In his final interviews, he spoke about storms sent by God to humble a man. He never publicly confessed to the crimes he was accused of, but those who knew him said he was haunted by guilt. Some of his closest associates claimed he spent his last months trying to reconcile with those he hurt, though none of the victims ever confirmed this. In 2017, Bishop Eddie Long died of cancer at the age of 63. His funeral drew thousands. Former presidents, celebrities, and ordinary believers who still couldn't reconcile the man they admired with the accusations that destroyed him. His coffin was carried through the same sanctuary where he once commanded an empire. The choir sang hymns of redemption. Outside, Protesters held signs demanding justice for the young men whose lives were changed forever. For them, his death brought no closure. One of the victims told a reporter, "He taught me how to dress, how to speak, how to pray, and how to keep secrets. I've been trying to unlearn that ever since." In the years since his death, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church has continued under new leadership. The new pastor rarely mentions Long's name, but among older members, his shadow lingers. His photos were quietly removed from the hallways. The stained glass window once dedicated in his honor was replaced. The memory of his sermons still echoes through recordings online, reminders of how powerful his words once were, and how much pain they eventually caused. Eddie Long's story isn't a simple tale of sin and punishment. It's about the seduction of authority. How a man who preached purity could twist faith into justification for control. It's about how institutions close ranks to protect their image, even as the innocent suffer. And it's about the tragic way power, when unchecked, corrodes even the most convincing mask of righteousness. People still argue about whether Long ever truly faced justice. Some say God dealt with him in his own time. Others say human justice never came at all. But one truth remains. Behind every empire built on blind devotion lies the potential for destruction. Not because of God, but because of men who forget that they are not Him. When the lights of the megachurch dimmed that final night, and the last hymn faded into silence, the faithful walked away carrying something heavier than sorrow. They carried the realization that sometimes the loudest preacher of purity can be the one hiding the darkest sin. In the quiet farming community of Toledo, Ohio, Pastor Gerald O. Robinson was known as a gentle, scholarly man, soft-spoken, polite, and unwaveringly devoted to his congregation. As a Catholic priest, he'd spent decades hearing confessions, blessing marriages, and baptizing newborns. To many, he was the kind of priest people trusted instinctively, the one who showed up at hospitals, comforted grieving families, and led prayers at funerals with tears in his eyes. But for one nun, Sister Margaret Ann Paul, that trust would end in unthinkable betrayal. It was the morning of Holy Saturday, April 5, 1980, a day of solemn preparation before Easter. The corridors of Mercy Hospital were hushed, filled with the faint hum of medical equipment and the echo of nuns moving quietly between patients' rooms. At 8:15 a.m., one of the sisters discovered something that would shatter the illusion of peace forever. In the chapel's sacristy, the sacred room where priests prepare for Mass, Sister Margaret's body lay sprawled on the floor. She had been brutally strangled and stabbed 32 times. Her white nun's habit was pulled up, her body arranged in a disturbing and ritualistic manner. There was evidence of a sexual assault. The candles were knocked over, and a cloth had been draped across her chest in the shape of a cross. For the devout community that lived and worked at Mercy Hospital, the murder was beyond comprehension, a grotesque violation of everything they believed sacred. Police swarmed the hospital searching for answers. At first, investigators suspected an intruder, perhaps a drifter or patient. But there were no signs of forced entry. The crime scene suggested the killer knew the chapel intimately, where the keys were, where the altar linens were kept, even how to move through the hospital unseen. Then, as detectives interviewed the staff, one name surfaced repeatedly: Father Gerald Robinson. He was the hospital chaplain, the one who had been scheduled to lead Mass that morning. When questioned, Robinson appeared calm. He said he had found the body himself and had tried to help, but it was too late. Police noticed scratches on his arm, which he claimed came from a cat. When investigators searched his quarters, they found a sword-shaped letter opener, one that matched the dimensions of Sister Margaret's stab wounds. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. In a small city bound by faith, accusing a priest of such a crime was unthinkable. The case went cold. For more than 2 decades, the murder of Sister Margaret was whispered about but never resolved. Her death became one of Toledo's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, until a new detective, Steve Forrester, reopened the case in the early 2000s. Advances in forensic testing offered new possibilities. The old crime scene photographs were re-examined, and what they revealed reignited suspicion. The pattern of stab wounds formed a chilling shape, a cross. It wasn't random violence. It was ritual. Then came a revelation that twisted the case into darker territory. A woman named Helen Schaefer, who had attended counseling sessions with Robinson years earlier, came forward with shocking claims. She said that as a child, she had been part of a secret satanic ritual circle led by priests and nuns, and that Robinson had been one of the main participants. Her story sounded unbelievable, but she described symbols, rites, and even the precise layout of Mercy Hospital's chapel, all of which matched existing evidence. Investigators focused once again on Robinson. Forensic tests compared blood transfer patterns from the crime scene with his letter opener. Though DNA testing at the time couldn't definitively prove his guilt, the physical evidence, combined with inconsistencies in his statements, was enough for prosecutors to act. In 2004, Father Gerald Robinson was arrested 24 years after the murder. The Catholic community erupted in disbelief. Parishioners flooded the courthouse in support of their priest, holding rosaries and chanting prayers. The church maintained its silence, distancing itself from the case but offering Robinson legal support. During the trial in 2006, prosecutors painted a chilling picture. A priest consumed by rage, perhaps after an argument with Sister Margaret, who was known to be strict about church procedure. They suggested the killing was ritualistic, a perverse inversion of faith. The defense, on the other hand, claimed there was no physical evidence linking Robinson to the crime and that the state's case was based on anti-Catholic hysteria. But the jury was unconvinced. The evidence of his presence at the crime scene, the matching weapon, and his inconsistent statements were enough. On May 11, 2006, Robinson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He was 78 years old. Even behind bars, Robinson continued to insist on his innocence. He served Mass in the prison chapel, hearing confessions from other inmates. Supporters visited him regularly, convinced he was a victim of a witch hunt. But investigators never wavered. They believed he had planned the murder carefully, disguising it as a spiritual act, a twisted parody of faith. As the years passed, the case became the subject of documentaries, books, and endless speculation. Some viewed it as proof of evil hiding beneath the cassock, a chilling reminder of how blind trust can conceal monstrous acts. Others refused to believe that a priest could commit such horror, clinging to the idea that the church had been unfairly targeted. In 2014, Robinson's appeals were denied. He spent his final years in a prison hospital, frail and silent. On July 4, 2014, he died of natural causes at the age of 76. No confession ever came. Sister Margaret Ann Paul's grave lies in a small Catholic cemetery near Toledo. Her tombstone is simple, engraved with her name and the words, "Servant of God." Every year on Holy Saturday, a few former nurses and sisters leave flowers at her grave, quiet tributes to a woman whose devotion ended in betrayal. The chapel where she was killed has long been renovated, its walls repainted, the altar replaced. But to those who remember that day, the air there never feels clean. Some claim they can still feel her presence, a lingering sense of sorrow and accusation, as if her spirit refuses to let the truth fade into comfort. The story of Father Gerald Robinson is not just about murder. It's about how authority, when wrapped in holiness, can paralyze judgment. It's about a system that hesitates to see the monster in a collar. And it's about faith, how it can heal, but also how it can blind. When the verdict was read, one juror wept. Later she told a reporter, "It's hard to say guilty when you're looking at a man of God. But then you remember the pictures of that nun. You remember what he did. And you realize he stopped being a man of God long before we ever knew his name." For Toledo, the case remains an open wound, a story whispered every Easter when people gather in churches to pray for redemption. Some say it's a warning that evil doesn't always come in the form of strangers in the dark. Sometimes it wears a collar and stands behind the altar, whispering words of faith through lips that have already betrayed it. In Houston, Texas, the congregation of the Second Baptist Church once gathered every Sunday to hear the words of Reverend Joe Keith Jordan, a man whose sermons were fiery, passionate, and full of conviction. He spoke about grace, redemption, and the dangers of sin. His deep Southern drawl carried authority. His charm disarmed even the most skeptical listener, and his life, at least on the surface, seemed to embody the purity he preached. Married, with children, and beloved by his flock, Jordan was the kind of pastor people trusted with their secrets. But behind that pulpit, behind the polished shoes and the gentle smile, he was hiding a secret that would one day destroy his ministry and his family, a secret soaked in greed, deception, and death. The story began in the mid-1990s, when Reverend Jordan and his wife Diane were struggling financially. The church wasn't large, and though they lived modestly, Joe always wanted more prestige, more influence, and more wealth. He often told friends that God rewards faithfulness with abundance, a message that conveniently justified his growing obsession with material success. Around this time, Joe met a wealthy widow named Betty Harrison, a longtime church member who had lost her husband 2 years earlier. She was kind, soft-spoken, and known for her generosity. Betty trusted Joe completely. He'd been her spiritual counselor after her husband's death, often visiting her home for prayer and comfort. Over time, those visits became more frequent and more personal. Joe began helping her manage her finances, advising her on tithes and charitable donations. He convinced her that giving more to the church would honor her late husband's memory. Betty, grateful for his attention, began transferring large sums of money into church accounts. She even changed her will, naming Jordan and his ministry as primary beneficiaries. No one thought much of it at first. After all, Betty was deeply religious and generous by nature. Then one night in 1998, Betty was found dead in her home. The cause, carbon monoxide poisoning. Her car was still running in the garage, and the medical examiner ruled it an accident, a tragic mistake likely due to forgetfulness. The community mourned her death, and Reverend Jordan delivered a moving eulogy, speaking through tears about the faith of a woman who gave until her final breath. A few months later, Betty's estate was settled. To everyone's surprise, over $350,000 went directly to Jordan's ministry. Some parishioners whispered that it didn't feel right. Others defended him, saying God had blessed him for his kindness. But those whispers never quite went away. Over the next few years, Jordan's spending became impossible to ignore. He bought a new car, moved his family into a larger house, and started wearing expensive suits to church. When questioned, he brushed it off, saying the blessings were gifts from believers. Behind the scenes, though, his greed was escalating. He began forging donation checks, pocketing cash meant for the church, and taking out loans in the names of elderly congregation members. The breaking point came when an elderly couple, Clarence and May Wilson, approached the local sheriff after discovering that their savings account had been drained. They said they had never authorized the transactions but noticed Joe Jordan's signature on several documents. Detectives launched an investigation and soon uncovered a web of fraud spanning several years. Jordan had stolen nearly $800,000 from church funds, parishioners, and trusts he'd been entrusted to manage. But just as investigators were closing in, a new revelation reawakened the ghosts of the past. Inconsistencies in Betty Harrison's death. One detective, reviewing the old file, noticed something strange. The garage door where she was found was open when police arrived. That would have made it nearly impossible for her to die of carbon monoxide poisoning. And her car key wasn't in the ignition. It was on the kitchen counter. When the detective re-interviewed some church members, a new story began to form. A church secretary admitted that, shortly before Betty's death, she overheard Joe arguing with her about money. Another member claimed he saw Joe leaving Betty's home late the night before she died. Then came the financial motive. The life insurance policy Betty had recently updated, leaving Jordan's ministry as the sole beneficiary. In 2003, 25 years after he first entered the ministry, Reverend Joe Keith Jordan was arrested for fraud, theft, and the murder of Betty Harrison. The trial that followed was one of the most shocking in Texas church history. The prosecution argued that Jordan had manipulated Betty emotionally and spiritually, using his position as her pastor to gain control over her finances, and eventually ended her life when she began questioning him. In court, the evidence was damning. Forensic experts testified that Betty's death could not have been accidental. The carbon monoxide levels in her blood were inconsistent with the open garage. Traces of a sedative were found in her system. Her home showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting she knew her killer. And the financial records painted a clear motive: greed disguised as faith. Jordan took the stand, insisting he was innocent. He claimed Betty had been depressed and that her death was a tragic accident. He portrayed himself as a victim of misunderstanding and persecution, a man of God being crucified by the media. But his calm demeanor cracked under cross-examination. When the prosecutor read his own sermons back to him, the ones about honesty, humility, and the sin of covetousness, Jordan lowered his head. The jury took just 7 hours to deliberate. He was found guilty on all counts: murder, fraud, and theft, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, his wife sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. She had believed his innocence until that moment. In prison, Jordan tried to start a small Bible study group, but most inmates avoided him. They called him Preacher Joe, sometimes mocking him, sometimes asking for prayers. Guards later reported that he rarely spoke, spending most of his days writing in a journal and reading the Psalms. When reporters asked him years later if he had any regrets, he said only, "God forgives all things." But the victims' families never accepted that. "Maybe God forgives him," one of Betty's relatives said, "but we don't." Today, the church building where he once preached is gone, sold and repurposed as a daycare center. The pulpit where he once stood is gone too, replaced with a playground. The congregation scattered long ago, leaving only the memory of a pastor who used faith as a mask for greed and murder. The story of Reverend Joe Keith Jordan stands as a reminder of the oldest warning in Scripture, that wolves often come dressed as shepherds. For his congregation, it wasn't just about losing money or trust. It was about realizing that evil had spoken to them every Sunday, wearing a smile and holding a Bible. Even now, decades later, the people who once called him Pastor Joe struggle to talk about it. Some still attend other churches, more cautious now, hesitant to trust. Others left faith altogether. Because once you've watched a man twist God's name to justify a crime, you start to wonder whether salvation can ever really be spoken through human lips at all. In the quiet suburban sprawl of Bossier City, Louisiana, the morning sermons of Pastor Danny Ray Polk were a lifeline for hundreds. He was the kind of preacher who could make people cry and laugh in the same breath, fiery yet gentle, humble yet commanding. His church, the Living Waters Assembly of God, was small but tightly knit. Members described him as a man who truly cared. He visited the sick, helped the poor, and often told his congregation, "God doesn't just test us through suffering, He tests us through temptation." But for Pastor Polk, temptation would not come in the form of greed or anger. It would arrive quietly over time in the guise of comfort, a comfort he would eventually destroy with his own hands. The story that unfolded behind his pulpit would expose a darkness so complete that even the faithful couldn't find words for it. It began in 2006, when Polk and his wife opened their home to a troubled teenager named Ashley, a 16-year-old girl who attended the church's youth group. Her family life was chaotic. Her father had been in and out of jail, and her mother struggled with addiction. Polk told the congregation that he and his wife wanted to give Ashley a stable Christian home. "We can't just preach love," he said. "We have to live it." For a while, everything seemed fine. Ashley started doing better in school. She volunteered at Sunday service, joined the choir, and often spoke about how Pastor Polk and his wife saved my life. But behind closed doors, Polk was grooming her, slowly, carefully, and deliberately. He began isolating her from friends, telling her that the world outside their church was full of sin. He gave her gifts, a necklace, a new Bible, a cell phone, and began calling her late at night under the pretense of prayer. Then came the physical contact. Small at first, a hand on her shoulder during prayer, a hug that lingered too long. He told her that God had given them a special bond. By the time Ashley realized what was happening, she was too deep in his manipulation to escape. He convinced her that their relationship was spiritual, that it was something God wanted. The abuse continued for nearly 2 years. He controlled her completely. When she could go out, who she could talk to, even what she wore. He threatened her with damnation if she told anyone, saying, "You'd ruin God's work if people knew." But secrets rarely stay buried forever. In 2008, Ashley confided in a youth group friend who told her mother. Within days, the police were involved. When detectives arrived at the Polk home, they found Ashley crying, terrified and unable to speak. The initial report described a child under extreme emotional distress, consistent with prolonged grooming and manipulation. When confronted, Polk denied everything. He claimed Ashley was confused, that she was making things up because she wanted attention. But as investigators searched his phone and computer, they found hundreds of text messages and emails, messages where he called her my angel, my blessing, and my gift from God. In one message he wrote, "You and I are chosen. What we have is beyond sin." In 2010, Danny Ray Polk was arrested and charged with sexual battery and child exploitation. The congregation was stunned. Many refused to believe it. Some blamed Ashley, saying she had seduced him. Others left the church entirely, unwilling to be part of a community that could protect a man like that. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of grooming and coercion. They showed how Polk had used his pastoral authority to manipulate Ashley's trust, how he had exploited her vulnerability under the guise of mentorship. They read out his messages in court, words that had once been whispered in secrecy now echoing across the courtroom like a curse. Ashley testified in a trembling voice, her hands shaking as she described the years of fear and confusion. "He told me I was chosen," she said. "He told me it was holy." Her testimony broke the courtroom's silence, and for the first time, Polk looked down, not in prayer, but in shame. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison without parole, calling his actions a calculated betrayal of faith and trust. In prison, Polk tried to maintain his image as a man of God. He led Bible studies for inmates, claiming he had been tempted by the devil. But the prison chaplain refused to let him lead services for younger inmates, saying, "Some men use Scripture as a weapon. He's one of them." Ashley's life was forever changed. She struggled with depression and guilt for years, haunted by the fear that people still blamed her. But she refused to let her voice be silenced. A decade later, she began speaking publicly about her experience, advocating for victims of clergy abuse. In an interview, she said, "He told me I was God's chosen. Now I know I'm my own." The Living Waters Assembly of God was dissolved shortly after Polk's sentencing. The building was sold, the pews removed. Locals say that for a long time people avoided driving past it at night, not because they believed it was haunted, but because it reminded them that evil doesn't always come roaring. Sometimes it whispers Scripture. In 2021, Polk's parole hearing was denied. The board cited his lack of genuine remorse and the severity of manipulation. He remains incarcerated to this day, serving the rest of his sentence in Louisiana State Penitentiary. The community still feels the aftershocks. Some of his former congregants admit that they've never stepped into another church since his arrest. Others say they still pray for him, hoping he finds forgiveness. But for Ashley, forgiveness isn't the point. "He took God from me," she said in a later interview, "so I found peace without him." And in that statement lies the cruel paradox of stories like these, where faith, twisted by deception, becomes the very thing it was meant to save people from. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.